February 7th, 2017, Oroville Dam, California. The tallest dam in the country is releasing water down its main spillway, exactly as designed, and the concrete tears itself apart. Not from age, not from neglect, from doing its job. 2 days later, an emergency spillway, never used once in 50 years, gets tested for the first time and starts eroding too. 188,000 people get told to leave immediately. 6 years and $1.1 billion later, engineers reopen that same spillway and call the release small. If it's fixed, why are they still this careful? I look at spillway failures and forensic reports for a living, and I want to be precise here, because the physics matters more than the panic. This wasn't a random storm breaking a dam. This was a 50-year-old design finally meeting the exact conditions it was never built to survive, and the water simply told the truth about it. Let's get the scale of this reservoir straight first, because the numbers only mean something once you understand what they're sitting on top of. Lake Oroville isn't a small local pond behind a levee. It's a working piece of the California State Water Project, and downstream from that dam sit families, farmland, fisheries, and drinking water infrastructure that stretches far beyond Butte County. When people picture a dam failed, they picture a wall breaking. That's not what happened here, and honestly, that's what makes this case more interesting, not less. The wall didn't break. The systems built to control what the wall releases broke, and that distinction is the entire story. Here's the part that bothers me professionally. The official narrative that circulated in 2017 was simple. Unprecedented rain, overwhelmed reservoir, infrastructure did its best under extreme pressure. That's not false. It's just not the whole story, and the difference matters because the storm was extreme and the storm exposed a preventable weakness are two completely different conclusions with two completely different lessons. In January 2018, a 6-person independent forensic team, put together at the demand of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, finished a 9-month investigation and released a 584-page report. I want you to sit with that number for a second. 584 pages to explain a concrete chute failing. That's not the length of a document explaining bad luck. That's the length of a document explaining a system. Their conclusion, and I'm going to say this exactly the way they framed it, the incident was caused by a long-term systemic failure of the Department of Water Resources, regulators, and general industry practice to recognize and address inherent spillway design and construction weaknesses, poor bedrock quality, and deteriorated chute conditions. Read that again. Not an unforeseeable event, not an act of God. A failure to recognize weaknesses that already existed. That sentence is doing a lot of quiet, uncomfortable work. Here's something else about that investigation that I think gets skipped over. This was actually the first major dam incident investigation where human factors were given the same weight as physical factors. Not an afterthought, not a paragraph at the end blaming operators, equal footing with the concrete and the bedrock. That's a meaningful choice by investigators because it means the final report isn't just a structural autopsy. It's also asking who looked at this spillway over 50 years, what they saw, and what they decided to do about it. When a forensic team puts human decision-making on the same level as material failure, they're telling you the failure wasn't purely physical. It was also a failure of judgment, repeated over decades by different people who each had a reasonable excuse in the moment. Okay, here's where the actual mechanism gets interesting, because this is where people usually check out, and this is exactly the part they shouldn't skip. The main spillway is a long concrete chute, built in sections, sitting on rock. Water runs down it fast. Under that concrete, there are cracks and joints, because there are always cracks and joints over 50 years. Water finds those cracks. It gets underneath the slab, and once water is trapped under a slab that's under enormous downward pressure from water rushing on top of it, you get uplift. The pressure pushing up from underneath can exceed the structural strength of the concrete holding it down. That's not corrosion. That's not erosion in the way people picture erosion. That's hydraulic force finding the one place the design didn't account for, and winning. Here's why that detail is not trivia. Once that slab lifted, on February 7th, 2017, it exposed the rock underneath directly to the full force of the water, and the rock underneath wasn't good rock. The forensic team's language was poor spillway foundation conditions in some locations. That's a phrase built to sound clinical. What it actually means is that the ground this multi-million-dollar concrete structure was anchored into was never strong enough to handle what happened when the concrete above it failed. The slab didn't just crack, it tore off, and it took the ground with it. And that missing ground caused more slabs to tear off. And the hole kept growing while the dam kept releasing water because it had nowhere else to send it. Picture that for a second, because this is not an abstract engineering event. You've got a chute the length of several football fields, angled steeply downhill, with tens of thousands of cubic feet of water per second thundering down it. Then, mid-release, a section of that concrete lifts off the ground like a manhole cover popping under pressure, and instead of smooth engineered chute underneath, there's raw exposed rock that was never meant to take a direct hit from that volume of moving water. Once that rock starts eroding, you don't get a small pothole. You get a crater growing in real time, underneath a structure that's still actively passing tens of thousands of cubic feet of water every second, because you can't just switch a flood control spillway off mid-storm. I want to be fair here. Nobody in 1968, when this dam was finishing construction, was being careless on purpose. But a half-century gap between "we built this" and "this failed" is exactly the kind of gap where warning signs get buried in paperwork nobody reopens. I can't tell you with certainty whether prior inspections flagged chute cracking and got waved off, because that detail isn't confirmed in what's public. What I can tell you is that systemic failure to recognize is not a phrase investigators use when the problem was invisible. It's a phrase they use when the problem was visible to somebody at some point and didn't get escalated the way it should have. Then the emergency spillway kicks in because that's what it's there for. And this is the part I find almost darkly funny in the way infrastructure failures sometimes are. This structure had existed since the dam was built and had never been used, not once. 50 years of standing there as a backup plan nobody had to test. And the very first time reality asked it to do its job, water started eroding the hillside underneath it, threatening to undercut the whole structure. That's not a coincidence. That's untested infrastructure meeting its first real stress test and immediately showing you why untested infrastructure is a gamble, not a plan. Right there is where the evacuation order gets issued. 188,000 people in Butte, Sutter, and Yuba counties told to leave immediately because the two systems that were supposed to protect them, the main spillway and the backup spillway, were both compromised at the same time. I don't think people fully register how rare that is. You don't usually lose your primary and your failsafe in the same 72 hours. When you do, that's not bad weather. That's a systems failure happening on two tracks at once. Think about what that evacuation actually looked like on the ground. Not a scheduled drill, not a slow-moving advisory, an order to leave right now for entire counties, because the people running one of the tallest dams in the country could not guarantee in that moment that the hillside below the emergency spillway would hold. That's the kind of decision water managers dread making, because it means admitting in public, in real time, that the backup plan is also in trouble. I've seen agencies delay that kind of announcement to avoid panic. To their credit, this time they didn't. But the fact that the call had to be made at all tells you the margin for error had already run out. Now let's talk about the money, because the money tells you almost as much as the concrete does. The Department of Water Resources awarded the repair contract to Kiewit Corporation in April of 2017, based on an estimated bid of $275 million. By the time the work was actually done, that portion alone had climbed to $630 million. DWR's own internal costs rose to $310 million, On top of that, $160 million went to emergency response, sediment removal, temporary power lines, the stuff you don't plan for because you didn't expect to need it. Total repair cost, $1.1 billion, finished in November of 2018. Here's the reversal people miss. That cost didn't balloon because contractors were padding invoices. It ballooned because every time crews opened up another section of the old structure, they found more of the original construction was worse than presumed. The rising price tag wasn't a symptom of waste. It was the truth about a 50-year-old design surfacing in real time, one exposed section at a time. Reporting at the time actually tracked this. The total cost climbed by roughly $1 million a day between April 2017 and mid-2018. That's not a number you get from overspending. That's a number you get from discovering, section by section, that the original problem was bigger than anyone wanted to admit on day one. And who pays for that? FEMA was slated to cover 75%. The rest falls on state water project customer agencies, including the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, meaning ratepayers hundreds of miles away, who never set foot near this dam, are covering part of the bill for a design flaw from the 1960s. That's the quiet part of infrastructure failure. It doesn't just cost the place where it happened, it gets spread across everyone downstream of the invoice. I want to flag one more thing about that contract because procurement details are usually where the boring stuff hides the real story. Kiewit didn't get handed an open-ended check. They bid $275 million for a defined scope of work, and the scope kept changing because the site kept revealing more damage than the original assessment accounted for. That's not the same thing as a contractor exploiting a crisis. That's what happens when the diagnosis phase and the construction phase get compressed together under emergency conditions, because you can't leave a damaged spillway unrepaired through another rainy season while you take your time studying it. Emergency timelines are good for public safety and terrible for cost control. And this project is a textbook case of exactly that tension. Let's go back to the emergency spillway for a second, because there's a second layer here that I think is the most honest tell in the entire story. After 2017, DWR reinforced that emergency spillway with concrete. Good, necessary. But here's the thing that should make you pause. Even after the reinforcement, water managers still don't treat it as something safe to rely on for regular use. Not confidently, not routinely. Think about what that actually means. You spent money hardening a backup system, and the professional posture afterward is still, we'd rather not use this if we can avoid it. That's not caution for caution's sake. That's an implicit admission that the reinforcement improved the odds without eliminating the underlying risk. If they were confident it was solved, they'd use it like a normal spillway. They don't. Now here's where the monitoring story gets genuinely uncomfortable, and I don't think enough people connect this dot. As part of the rebuild, DWR installed new instrumentation throughout the reconstructed spillway, specifically to monitor pressure, drainage, and structural movement while it's operating. They also now inspect 51,000 feet of drainage piping supporting the spillway on an annual basis. Sit with that for a second. 51,000 feet of piping, checked every year, plus live pressure and movement sensors, running under a structure that operated for decades with nothing like this in place. The fact that they needed to add all of this after the failure tells you plainly that the original spillway ran essentially blind for 50 years. Nobody was watching the pressure under that slab in real time back in 2017. That's exactly the kind of data gap that turns a slow building weakness into a sudden catastrophic one, because by the time you can see the problem with your eyes, the water's already won. And I want to be clear about something here, because this is where a lot of infrastructure coverage gets lazy. None of this instrumentation is exotic technology. Pressure sensors, drainage monitoring, structural movement gauges, this is standard practice at modern dam sites, not some experimental fix. The legitimate question isn't whether the technology works. It clearly does, and it's giving engineers real-time information they never had before. The question is why a structure of this scale, feeding a system that serves millions of people, went half a century without it. That's not a technology fit problem, that's a technology adoption problem, and it's a much more damning one, because it means the tools to catch this existed the whole time. They just weren't installed until after the concrete had already torn itself apart. Here's a detail that I think undercuts the "it's fixed now" narrative more than anything else in this case, and it's recent. The main spillway reopened for a small test release on April 2nd, 2019. Then it sat, completely unused, for 4 full years. 4 years of total silence on that structure. Then, on March 10th, 2023, after a winter of heavy storms, DWR opened it again for flood control, for the first time since 2019, starting at 15,000 cubic feet per second. 15,000 out of a spillway rated to handle 270,000, and officials on record called that a relatively small release. I want you to notice the caution in that language, because caution from engineers who just spent over $1 billion rebuilding a structure is not neutral. It's data. Through the rest of 2023, DWR ended up releasing more than 2.37 million acre-feet through that spillway, about 67% of the entire capacity of Lake Oroville, with flows reaching 36,000 cubic feet per second that spring. And officially, the spillway continued to perform and operate as designed. Fine, I believe that. But here's the part that quietly complicates the reassurance. Afterward, DWR still had to go back in and perform new concrete and sealant repairs, roughly 500 square feet of it, on a contract handled by Sablon Reed, under 0.1% of the total spillway surface. Sure, that's small, but small is not zero, and the agency's own explanation was that periodic repairs are simply expected because of temperature swings, sun exposure, and use. This is the reversal I want you to actually absorb, because it's the whole case in miniature. Passing 2/3 of the lake's capacity through the rebuilt spillway produced new cracking that needed patching within the same year. That doesn't mean the fix failed. It means the fix reduced the failure mode without eliminating the underlying physics. Concrete under sun, under seasonal temperature swings, under the force of moving water, is always going to need maintenance. You didn't engineer that variable away, you engineered it down. That's an important distinction, and it's one the "it's fixed" headlines never make. I also want to be fair about something, because skepticism without fairness turns into fear-mongering, and I'm not interested in that. The rebuilt spillway is genuinely better than the original. It's anchored differently into the bedrock. It has drainage systems the old one didn't have. It has instrumentation the old one never had. Engineers aren't lying when they say it performed as designed in 2023. What I'm saying is narrower and, I think, more useful. Performing as designed under 67% capacity is not the same claim as being permanently solved. Those are two different sentences, and only one of them is actually being made by the people who work on this dam every day. Let's talk about what got washed downstream, because this part doesn't get nearly enough attention in the retellings that focus only on the evacuation. When that hillside eroded below the emergency spillway, and when the main chute tore apart, all of that material, tons of sediment, went straight into the Feather River. That river is salmon and steelhead habitat, species that were already blocked from a huge amount of their natural spawning grounds by the existence of the dam itself. So you have a population already squeezed by the infrastructure, and then a sediment plume smothers additional miles of the habitat they had left. This isn't a side note. This is the ecological cost of an infrastructure failure that gets almost no airtime compared to the human evacuation story, and it's arguably permanent in a way the concrete repairs aren't. Here's why that matters biologically, and I'll keep it simple. Salmon and steelhead need clean gravel beds to spawn in, places where oxygenated water can actually reach their eggs. Bury that gravel under a fresh layer of eroded sediment, and you don't just inconvenience a fish population for a season, you can knock out a spawning class entirely, because the eggs laid in smothered gravel don't get the oxygen exchange they need to survive. Concrete gets repaired on a construction timeline. A damaged spawning run recovers on a biological timeline, and those two timelines are not the same length. Nobody in the spillway performed as designed press releases is talking about which one of those clocks actually matters more downstream. Here's the bigger frame I want to leave you with, because Oroville isn't actually a story about one weird dam. Oroville is one of 15,498 dams across the country currently classified as high hazard potential, which is roughly 17% of every cataloged dam in America. High hazard doesn't mean the dam is in bad condition. It means that if it fails, human life and property downstream are directly at risk. Oroville shares that classification with thousands of other structures you've never heard of, most of which are also decades old, most of which were also designed under assumptions about rainfall and bedrock that were reasonable when they were built and are increasingly not reasonable now. And that brings me to the climate piece, because I think this is the most uncomfortable thread in the entire case. Researchers at Scripps Institution of Oceanography and the University of Colorado studied the specific atmospheric river sequence that dumped water into Lake Oroville right before the 2017 failure. For anyone unfamiliar, an atmospheric river is basically a long, narrow band in the sky carrying enormous amounts of water vapor from the Pacific straight into the mountains, and when a series of them line up back to back, they can dump feet of rain and snowmelt into a single watershed in a matter of days. That's exactly what happened heading into February 2017. Their finding, in plain language, a warmer climate is expected to produce more intense versions of exactly that kind of storm event, the kind that overwhelms a reservoir faster than its infrastructure was designed to handle. That's not a political statement, that's a hydrology statement. The design assumptions baked into a 1960s spillway were built around the storms of that era. The storms aren't staying in that era. So here's what a genuinely different approach would have looked like if we're talking about professional standard of care instead of crisis response. You don't wait until a chute tears itself apart to discover your foundation rock is inadequate. You instrument the structure before the failure, not after. You treat drainage inspection as a routine baseline, not a reactive upgrade you install once people have already been evacuated. You reassess a spillway's design margins against current climate data, not the rainfall assumptions from the year it was poured. None of that is exotic engineering. It's just monitoring before disaster instead of monitoring after it, and that's the exact sequence that got reversed here. That's the standard of care line I keep coming back to in cases like this one. A competent water management plan doesn't treat "it hasn't failed yet" as evidence that it won't. It treats age, unmonitored conditions, and known bedrock uncertainty as active risk factors that need data on a schedule, whether or not anything looks wrong on the surface. The moment you're relying on visual inspection alone for a structure moving hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of water per second, you've already accepted that you'll find out about the next problem after it starts, not before. I keep coming back to one thing every time I read through this case, and it's this. The emergency spillway was there for 50 years as a promise, untested, and the very first time it had to keep that promise, it started failing too. That's not an unlucky coincidence. That's what happens when your backup plan has never once been asked to actually perform. So let's be honest about what actually happened here, because I think the tidy version people repeat, unprecedented storm, dam held, crisis averted, lets the real lesson slip right past everyone. This was never a story about one catastrophic storm. It was a 50-year-old design meeting, bedrock it was never suited to, discovered only because the water finally asked the question directly. $1.1 billion didn't buy a different foundation. It bought better concrete, better anchoring, and a lot more sensors watching a structure that used to run essentially blind. That's real progress. It is not the same thing as removing the risk. The bedrock underneath that spillway is still the same bedrock. The climate sending storms at that reservoir is sending bigger ones, not smaller ones. And the emergency spillway that engineers reinforced with concrete is still standing exactly where it always stood, still treated, even now, as something you'd rather not have to lean on. They didn't fix the dam. They started watching it properly. And watching closely is not the same thing as having solved the problem it's watching for.